Great, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this joint Green Finance Institute and E3G webinar to discuss one of the most recent papers that's been published by the Green Technical Advisory Group, or the GTAG, the government's independent advisory group on the implementation and design of the UK Green Taxonomy. I'm Ryan Jude, Programme Director for Green Taxonomy at the Green Finance Institute, where me and my team have been running the Secretariat for the GTAG for the last 2 years. We put out a series of papers working with our expert members, this being one of those papers, the culmination of one of the 5 major work streams, which has been chaired and led by our other speaker today, Kate Levick. Kate, would you like to quickly introduce yourself as well, please?
Hello, everybody. So my name's Kate Levick. I'm the Associate Director for Sustainable Finance at E3G. E3G is a climate politics think tank. We're one of the 2 NGO members of the Green Technical Advisory Group. And given the politics focus, it's been a real pleasure to chair the policy work stream in GTAG.
Great, thanks, Kate. So the format for today is Kate and I will be giving a quick introduction and overview of this paper and some of the recommendations that are coming out of it and some of the rationale as to why we need to determine and set out the policy links of the Green Taxonomy. And then there will be some Q&A at the end. So I've been asked to remind everyone to please use the Q&A function that should be on the Zoom for you, and then we'll ask some of your questions as we get towards the end. But before we get to that, if we go to the next slide, please. Before we get into the details of the paper, I was just going to give a very brief reminder as to what the taxonomy is, or an introduction to the taxonomy for anyone who's joined who hasn't come across the topic before. So the taxonomy, the Green Taxonomy, is a policy tool that is under development by the UK government that will serve as a dictionary for what a sustainable economic activity is in the UK context, supported by science-based definitions. It will cover all major sectors by emissions in the UK and could be further expanded to cover more areas in the future. And in fact, another GTAG paper touches on that in a bit more detail. But the whole idea behind the taxonomy is really twofold. Firstly, to prevent greenwashing, to fight against greenwashing, so to prevent firms overstating their green credentials, but also to enable firms, investors, and individuals to be able to compare apples to apples, to be able to compare the green claims of these firms, which leads to the second overarching objective, which is to mobilize capital towards green outcomes. And Kate will go into this in a bit more detail later as to how that links to some of the areas that we've recommended in this paper. But how will it work? Well, on the screen here, you've got 2 of the main parts of the taxonomy and how it works in practice. And these are the 3 tests that an activity must go through to prove it is green taxonomy aligned, to be able to say it is green, and also the 6 environmental objectives that underpin the taxonomy. So for an activity to be able to say it's green against the taxonomy, it must first prove it substantially contributes to one of the 6 environmental objectives on the screen here: climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention, sustainable use of water and marine resources, and protection of biodiversity. Once you prove you substantially contribute to one of those 6 by meeting the science-based definition inside the taxonomy, you must then prove that you do no harm to the other 5. And this is a really important step to ensure that in contributing to one environmental objective that the UK has, you don't harm another one. Of course, they're all interlinked. And then the final part is minimum safeguards, where after you've proved the first 2 tests, you must prove as a firm that you meet minimum social safeguards, such as aligning to the UN Principle on Business and Human Rights. So if an activity meets all 3 of these tests, it can then be disclosed as taxonomy aligned. So that's what the taxonomy regulation is. But then why did we need this workstream? Why did we need to be able to set out the links to other areas? So if we just jump to the next slide. So Kate will talk about the rationale in a second, but on screen here, we have the policy links diagram that we produced for this paper. This shouldn't be legible, don't worry, you shouldn't be able to read every word. You can find this in the paper. But this was to show the current state of play for major green finance regulations and other taxonomy-related policies that the UK government currently has, either in development or already in existence. As you can see, there is a lot being developed. On the disclosure side, related to taxonomy, there's the sustainability disclosure requirements and how that links to ISSB. And there's transition plans, which Kate and E3G are, of course, heavily involved in. And also on the financing side, there's green gilts, there's the UK Infrastructure Bank, and there's all this good stuff happening in the green finance space, but it can lead to confusion as to how all of them link together. So our diagram here is the first attempt we've seen to stitch together existing policy and show how they all link together. But that then got the GTAG thinking about, well, if you have the taxonomy in existence, what other areas of policy that haven't yet been developed could it support in a little more detail? And the recommendations in the paper include, firstly, for the Treasury to maintain a diagram like this on an ongoing basis. But then secondly, the major overarching recommendation of the paper is to act on the 20 policy areas that we identified. Which leads me to hand over to Kate to go through the rationale and to begin to touch on some of those areas.
Great, thank you very much, Ryan. If we could have the next slide, please. So for the UK Green Taxonomy, the GTAG has supported the UK around two primary purposes for that. And one is to guide the deployment of capital and the others to address greenwashing. So we've looked at the different policy uses of the taxonomy very much in that context. And we've been mindful that once you start defining what is a green investment, then that definition doesn't necessarily pertain to one type of market actor rather than another. So, you know, a definition of green investments clearly will be relevant in financial markets, and that's usually the primary user group that taxonomies around the world have been developed for. But green investment is also relevant to the public sector and to local authorities. And we have advised that it's not credible to create a definition of green for investment that only applies to private sector actors. So that's one very good reason to look at potential policy uses, because the state, the public sector, is itself also active in investment and in financial markets. So public bodies can actually act in different contexts. They can be direct investors. They can also be consumers of taxonomy related sort of activities, and they also, through their policy work, provide a strong steer that in many different ways enables other actors through the financial markets to take actions. So it's important to look at the rounded spectrum of different ways that the public sector acts in financial markets. This, of course, includes local authorities. We're not only talking about different parts of the national government and different arms of that, but also the many local authorities around the country. When we're looking at the UK's green transition, it's crucial that the local authority activity, their borrowing, capital spending, and policy decisions that will shape, the infrastructure on the ground going forwards are also consistent with the UK's transition and net zero targets. Taxonomies have sprung up around the world in the last few years. The Green Finance Initiative has been tracking those. There are 47 taxonomies currently under development or developed, and 41 of those outright state that part of the aim of that taxonomy is to guide policymakers and authorities, or else they're at such an early state of development that they haven't stated this yet. So this is not a surprising thing that the GTAG should look at, really, and it's really very important that the UK should get in early with its thinking about this. I think learning from experiences that have happened in other geographies, it's important to look at all the possible use cases and prioritise them, and design the taxonomy to fit those use cases, which of course is an opportunity that the UK now has with its taxonomy due out for consultation in the autumn. So, putting in mind all those arguments, this is why we felt that it was important for the UK to start to develop its thinking on where and how the taxonomy would apply to policy. We came up with some framing for how we thought about that, and we've also come up with some specific recommendations. So this slide tells you around those two purposes that I outlined previously and spells them out in a little bit more detail. So core purpose 1, promote market integrity, consumer protection, and the avoidance of greenwashing. And of course, that's always been a primary purpose for the UK green taxonomy and for other taxonomies too. Core purpose 2, also very important, and the UK has made it clear, through, for example, the Green Finance Strategy, that this is also part of what the UK taxonomy will do, is to mobilise capital to facilitate the achievement of UK environmental policy goals. And one of the things that the taxonomy can be particularly useful for is to help track progress as to whether those goals are actually being achieved, because it enables a kind of labelling of different kinds of investment. And the UK has specifically committed that it will be tracking green financial flows. So breaking these down in a little bit more detail, under core purpose 1, in terms of categorising the recommendations we made in this paper, we've broken it down into 3 different buckets. So one is government policy, promoting integrity through government policy, and that's really about the overall coherence of UK green policy and investment in public finance. The second one is tracking progress, which I just spoke about, where the taxonomy potentially has a particular role to help with labelling when funds are being measured and investments. And then lastly, but absolutely not least, consumer protection and preventing greenwashing, so that it's possible to support consumers to make good decisions. And then under core purpose 2, we've got 4 buckets there. So 2 of them, I guess, break down the mobilisation of capital between those actions that happen at the national level and those that are more in the hands of local public authorities. Then, of course, mobilising capital by the private sector and mobilising capital abroad, which is a broad brush item, but obviously some of the UK's policy decisions and some of its investments are on the international front and not just within the borders of the UK. So we've identified 1 or 2 that touch on that as well. Okay, next slide, please. Great, thank you. So we came up with 20 specific recommendations in this paper, and they fall into the different buckets that I've mentioned earlier, and the 2 core purposes in the following ways. So just to remind you, the green is sort of left-hand side of this slide. That's the core purpose 1, which is all about market integrity and consumer protection. Blue, which is on the right-hand side of the slide, this is more about mobilisation of finance for the transition. And to some extent breaking that down into different types of actors. So as you can see, we've got quite a bit there for government policy, different ways that we could use the taxonomy to support government policies, and that comes into quite a few different forms. So, for example, the UK will be taking forward sustainability disclosures and a broader sustainability disclosure regime. We would expect the taxonomy to play an important role in that. But a very different example might be a net zero test, where the UK could apply a sort of test to all of its public investment decisions and use the taxonomy to measure whether or not investments counted as green in the and the definitions created by the taxonomy. So these are very different kinds of government policy support. And another one, which I'll come to in a second, is around transition plans. It's going to be a requirement for financial firms and for listed companies to disclose climate transition plans, and there'll be a consultation as well on whether that should be extended to private companies. The taxonomy could be very important in terms of how firms talk about how they're shifting their investments. Tracking progress is also quite a big bubble here, and that's because of the particular role the taxonomy can play, again, with labelling financial flows. Sort of over more on the right-hand side, as you can see, we have some national bodies where the taxonomy could be used to guide their investments or to monitor and measure what they're doing, and a number of different actors at play here. So the UK Infrastructure Bank, the British Business Bank, the Green Gilts which the UK has been issuing or the national level. And in fact, some of that's already in hand. So the UK Infrastructure Bank has already said that it will be using the taxonomy to guide its investments, and the taxonomy is also referenced in the Green Gilts investment framework for use once it's been finalised. But also local authorities. So taxonomy could play a role in upskilling local authorities to invest in green infrastructure for the transition and for guiding the creation of loans for public works. There's also uses in public procurement, which is potentially both at national and local level. So I won't read out every single thing on this slide, but as you can see, there's a very wide range of possible uses. And, you know, you'll be relieved to know we're not going to spell them all out in detail in this webinar, but I would urge everybody to go and read the paper and have a look. GTAG's put forward this very broad range of uses really as a way to stimulate government thinking and open up the discussion about the possible ways the taxonomy should be used, and also to stimulate discussion of this issue before the taxonomy itself is finalised, because as I said before, actually deciding on what are the key use cases will and should inform the final design of the taxonomy. So next slide, please. So this is an example of one of the recommendations that we've made in the paper, one of 20. This is number 5, which is around supporting the integrity of transition plans. So I already mentioned this. Firms will need to be disclosing transition plans, and using the taxonomy when they do this can help them to show their coherence with government policy, can help them to measure what is or is not green. There's probably strong synergies with the sustainability disclosures reporting once that's come through, which we'd expect to encompass both taxonomy reporting and transition plan disclosure. So we have listed here in the cons column that you can see that there is some risk of sort of duplication and regulatory burden for UK firms, which also need to report against taxonomies from other jurisdictions, which of course will be the case for some international firms. So here there's, I guess, an implicit recommendation, which we have spelled out much more clearly in some other GTAG advice, that the UK government should be as much as possible aiming to ensure that its taxonomy is interoperable with and aligned to the taxonomies of other countries, so that we are building an international set of norms around what a green investment looks like. Zooming out a bit, you'll see in the way that this table is designed, which is the consistent design we have through the paper, that we give the name of the policy recommendation. We show in the top right hand box like which of the core purposes this is linked to, which in this case is the one around mobilizing finance, core purpose number 2, and then which sort of subcategory it falls into. We've given a brief summary of sort of how the application of this policy use would work, and then summarised what the GTAG recommendation is at the bottom, which in this case is that current and planned taxonomy alignment should be a key component in the developing transition plans framework. So maybe I should mention at this point that I'm also the co-head of the Secretariat of the Transition Plan Task Force, which has been developing best practice sort of guidance on what a good transition plan looks like under a different government mandate. So the GTAG has made formal inputs and provided advice to the Transition Plan Task Force, and all of that is being taken into account as the Transition Plan Task Force finalises its framework, which will be due later this year. So I can say for absolute certain that this policy use is certainly under consideration and being picked up. And of course, the UK government will then be moving to put in regulations, which again, hopefully will be able to pick up that advice. And then in the bottom right-hand box, for every recommendation, we've talked about who the relevant bodies are. And in this case, quite a lot of relevant bodies, because transition plans are a very live area right now. Lots of people are working on them. TPT is mentioned there, the Transition Plan Task Force, but also GFANZ, which has an international transition plan framework for the financial sector, some of the key regulators, both in the domestic context, in the EU and internationally. So I think that's my last slide, Ryan. Do I pass over back to you at this point?
Yes, brilliant. Thanks, Kate. So Thanks so much, Kate, for going through the overarching recommendations and the 20 specific policy areas. Hopefully, as you can all see, each of these areas GTAG has interrogated at length, looked at how can the taxonomy apply, what's the rationale behind it, what are the benefits of doing it, what are the potential pitfalls, how do we mitigate them, and also, again, for coherence, who are all the other bodies that we need to get involved and get working on this. So going now for the second half of the webinar to Q&A, I see my colleague Adam Standage is about to appear on screen. He's been following all the questions that have been coming in. Adam, over to you to ask some of the questions.
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you everyone who sent through some questions in the chat. Please do keep sending them through. We'll try and get through as many as possible over the remainder of the webinar. But I'll start off with what is quite a good general question, I think, before we go into some that are a little more specific. And this one probably best for you, Ryan. So what is the latest on the UK taxonomy and also GTAG's work as well? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I assume this would come up because obviously it's been a few years now since the taxonomy was first announced in the UK. And originally, the government was going to consult on this in March of last year. For various reasons, there's been slight delays, which led to a written ministerial statement at the end of last year from Treasury, mentioned they were going to delay to fix some of the usability points in taxonomy. And since then, happily, in the Green Finance Strategy this year, it was confirmed the consultation would take place in autumn of this year. So that's the latest from the government side. From GTAG, our remit ended over the summer, so 2 years worth of work, 2 years worth of advice. We've published some of our papers over the last 2 years, but if anyone's been following the GTAG and GFI LinkedIn over the last month, you'll see a flurry of papers as we're now putting all the remainder of our advice that we've given over the last 2 years into the public domain for consumption by anyone who is interested. And the idea is that these will all be out there prior to the government's consultation. So everyone will be able to see what we've recommended and also how it's been potentially acted upon. But the expectation is that first consultation, which we expect to focus, similar to the EU, on climate change mitigation in the first instance, will.
Thanks, Ryan. I think there have been a few questions that sort of relate to international interoperability and the experience of other taxonomies in terms of using them to support other policies. So I'm going to edit the question slightly and start by saying, Kate, what has the UK learned and what could the UK learn from other taxonomies in terms of the experience of creating these links with policies? And then I'll follow on by going to Ryan and asking more generally about GTAG and their approach to international interoperability for the taxonomy on a more broad sense. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So in terms of what we can learn, I think seeing the experience that different jurisdictions have had as they've started to bring forward taxonomies has been instructive on this point. The pioneer with creating a green taxonomy was the European Union. And in fact, the UK's taxonomy regulation is strongly linked to the EU work. That's something that was brought through into UK legislation at the point when we were still aligned with EU legislation. But since then, of course, the UK has the opportunity to build something a little different if it wishes to. And I think I don't think there's any secret that the UK's starting point, as has been for many countries, has been what the EU has done. The UK, of course, is looking at what's different in the UK context and also what the different learnings are from the EU and elsewhere about sort of what works and doesn't work. And I think what we'll see coming out in the autumn will reflect all that thinking. For anyone who's interested in the more technical detail of that, the GTAG has created advice to the UK government on sort of to what extent to take forward or not the different details of the EU taxonomy, and that's all available on the website as well. But one thing that was notably learned from the EU is that the purpose for the EU taxonomy originally, and we're going back to 2018 here, was extremely focused on the private sector market actors, a particular focus of greenwashing, didn't consider a very broad range of use cases explicitly, even though I'd say that, implicitly that was always there in the EU's finance strategy. But there were then, some quite sort of difficult public debates when the rubber started to hit the road and possible use cases needed to be decided in the short term, most notably during the COVID period, when there was a question of how to green recovery funds and to green the large-scale bonds that the EU was creating at that point, public bonds, and whether or not the taxonomy should be used for that, and if so, how. So, experiences like that, for example, we can learn from, in that, having seen some of that play out in the UK, we can anticipate that and start to think now about what are the public use cases that either we should plan for now or that may arise in the future, and make sure that the taxonomy is suitable for that, understand the timeline for when it might be usable for certain things, etc. I mean, one thing I could have mentioned, which you'll see in the paper, is that we've noted that there are different time horizons for some of the different recommendations that we've made. So, some of them are things that could be done in the next year. Others are things that might take 5 to 8 years. So understand that dimension is also important. I think that learning that we need to stand back, look at possible use cases and integrate in thinking about public sector use cases is something that has been picked up by other countries as well. So, we mentioned earlier this statistic that's sort of 41 out of 47 taxonomies internationally, if they're not too early to be sure, are saying that they're looking at the public sector use cases as well.
Thanks, Kate. I think just to add a bit more colour on the international side, as Kate mentioned, we published our advice, and one of our 5 major workshops is specifically on international interoperability, and we spent a lot of time talking to large multinationals, large international investors, but also other governments, other policymakers, other advisory groups to figure out the best approach to this. And as Kate said, the overarching first recommendation in that paper is that we should align as much as possible to the structure of the EU taxonomy to ease the burden on reporting. So having those same 6 environmental objectives, having those same 3 tests that I talked about right at the start of the webinar, when you already have that, you've got some semblance of interoperability already with, in this case, the EU, and the majority, 2/3 of the country-led taxonomies being developed have used the EU framework as their base. As Kate also said, there are some bits above that we can learn from, and also some bits that need to change for the UK context. There's a few examples here. Some are where the metric used in the EU taxonomy in a certain activity just might not be used in the UK. A good example here is energy performance certificates in buildings, where the final metric used in the EU is different to that used in the UK. So there needs to be a slight change there from a practical perspective. Another one is where the UK might have decarbonised the sector quicker than the EU. So, for example, our energy grid, our average grid intensity is 180 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour in the UK. It's 270 in the EU. So that means in the future, as both of those come down, we may need a different number. I'm not saying that we necessarily will for energy, but it's just an example of an area we might have gone a bit further. But as far as possible to ease the reporting, we want the structure to be the same. And the 10th recommendation in that international paper then says that we can do the other 9 things in the UK, and that's all great. But if other countries developing taxonomies don't also factor in these same principles, then there's still this issue of lack of interoperability. So the final recommendation is about the UK government using its voice in bilateral conversations with major partners and also in international fora, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, the G7, the G20, going to those groups and setting out why it's in our best interest to ensure interoperability across all the taxonomies.
Thank you both. In each of your answers, you talked a little about looking ahead, how some of the use cases are much more immediate. In fact, some of them, since the initial drafting of the paper, have already started to occur, and others are much more long-term. So there's been a question related to that. How do you think the policy and the recommendations in this paper would be affected or could be affected by any change in government and or the longer term over, say, the next 10 years rather than the immediate sort of next few years? Open to either of you if you'd like to answer. Thanks.
Happy to jump in first, Kate, if you want to then add a bit more colour on this. So firstly, we're seeing, obviously, from the current government commitment to consult on the taxonomy later this year. We're also seeing from the opposition, there's been a few for example, an amendment in the Financial Services and Markets Bill around the need to get the taxonomy out there as soon as possible. So I think from the perspective of the base regulation existing, I think there is cross-party consensus on this. On the ongoing basis, one of the fundamental questions that we were asked when we first started doing this policy links paper was, well, if the government changes, they might have different priorities, different things they want to have in the taxonomy, different things they want to link it to. How do we separate it from political interference? And this leads to the institutional home of the taxonomy, as we've been calling it. It's going to be the final paper we release at the end of this month, but setting out how is the taxonomy owned going forward? How do we ensure it's independent in a similar way to the Committee on Climate Change exists in an independent way to hold the government to account on carbon budgets? How do we ensure that any changes to taxonomy going forward, any areas of advice are completely science-based and completely divorced from political interference? And so we'll be very strongly recommending that a arms-length body is set up that holds it and holds the pen on that going forward to avoid any of that political interference happening.
Yeah, so just to build on that, I think this issue of sort of the forward institutional home for the taxonomy is key, because this is going to be a living tool which gets updated in light of changes in the world, changes in technology, changes in science, etc. And it's important that that is done on a independent science-based basis. I don't have a lot to add to what Ryan said on this topic. I think I would just want to pick up a little bit on being slightly naughty, because I know the questions are being helpfully curated by Adam, but I did notice in the Q&A there's a point particularly about sort of the burden on the public sector right now and the challenges of, for example, capacity in local councils and hospitals. I want to flag, first of all, that we're not recommending necessarily that the government should do all of these things. We're presenting a range of recommendations that the government can consider doing and presenting reasons why they might do them. That's the pros bit, and some reasons why they might not. That's the cons bit, and some mitigations to those cons. So we haven't suggested anything that we think is a terrible idea, but we're not necessarily expecting that the government may choose to do all 20 of these things, and not necessarily in short order. So that's one point. Another being that in terms of that, going back to that capacity point, the taxonomy is a tool that is intended to be useful. So although there are huge challenges in public services at the moment, and in some public sector delivery, we do at the same time have to have a climate change transition. And that is going to require huge investment. It is going to require huge capacity. We need tools like the taxonomy to make it clearer and simpler for people to know how to do. And that's the intention, rather than to create complexity and extra burden. It's not possible to do that without adding some more stuff to do. But I think it's really important to flag that for the public sector, the idea of using the taxonomy for any public sector use cases is to make it easier to achieve our public sector policy goals in a more credible way that will actually meet the goals we're trying to achieve. The reason why taxonomies were sort of created in the first place was because nobody was quite sure what was green and what wasn't green, or investments might be misallocated, or people might be doing things with the best intentions and it actually wasn't that great. This is the situation we're trying to avoid. So yes, it will be a huge challenge for any government to take forward the climate transition in the next few decades, but it is something we're going to have to do, and this tool is aimed to help us do it.
Just to build on this, on the local authority resources point, to the person's asked question, policy area 8 in the paper, the little table that we have, Kate obviously outlined transition plans in the webinar, touches specifically on technical assistance support for local authorities. And why the rationale behind this is that the UK Infrastructure Bank, for example, has said it will use taxonomy as a screen for its investments. And it follows, as the paper sets out, that government might in the future have green tinges to certain grant programs or certain borrowing programs via PWLB, and that is very likely to be linked to the taxonomy. So if you are in local authority, the ability to be able to understand and utilize that becomes important if you want to be able to access these areas of finance. But in policy area 8, we outline the fact that there are resource constraints. And so this sort of thing shouldn't be compulsory in the first instance, and there probably should be funded support from government to enable local authorities to upskill on this. And as we know, local authority resource constraints when it comes to being able to prioritise climate change is a much bigger issue. And that's another thing about a lot of these policy areas. They link to the need for other policies to be developed, not least increasing resources for local authorities.
Thanks, and also for covering the local authority aspect. I know we've got some people who are probably interested in this webinar from that perspective, so always good to hear that kind of question. There's one that's on a slightly different topic here, but it does have relevance to the transition planning aspect of the policy recommendation. And there's been a question about the appropriateness of a transition taxonomy. This was something that government said it would consider within the green finance strategy. So someone has asked what GTAG's thinking has been on this topic. And then if you would like to apply that alongside that to the recommendations in the paper, please do feel free. Thanks.
It's useful. I'll quickly just talk about our overarching thoughts on this. And Kate, maybe you can give a bit more detail on transition plans and what we've got. So another one of the several papers released by GTAG over the last few weeks sought to address this very specific question around an extended taxonomy, the appropriateness of it, the timing of it, and what's it seeking to solve. And essentially, the recommendation we came to is that we need to get green rights in the UK. Let's get the green taxonomy out there. It's been delayed already, but also there are other policies being developed. And this again comes back to that big policy diagram. There's plans, there's transition sectoral pathways being developed, and all these things linking together could in itself would be seeking to answer. So our recommendation was get green right in the first instance. Then, as Kate said earlier, the taxonomy is a living document. Every 3 years after it's implemented, it will be reviewed, it will be updated. So in that first review period, we should look at, have those other tools helped achieve what a transition taxonomy could achieve? And if so, we don't need one. If it hasn't, at that point, you should look to develop one and build upon what hopefully at that point is the success of the green taxonomy. Also, in the taxonomy, there are transition elements built into it, which I think is often forgotten. So the first thing is that review period, where there is a threshold. For example, in the EU, energy's threshold to substantially contribute is 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. If you're under that, you're a green energy generator. If you're over that, you're not. But in the first review period, if the grid in the EU is to carbonize a certain amount, 100 might not be enough to substantially contribute anymore. It might need to be lower, it might need to be 80, it might need to be 70. So this is built in already by having those review periods in there. There are also specific activities called transitional activities, which exist for an area where there currently isn't a net zero way to do that activity. Manufacture of cement is a good example. And in our recommendations, the minute you review the taxonomy, anything that's currently a transitional activity, if the technology is advanced, if there is now a net zero version, then that should be updated to accommodate that. So our overarching recommendation, and recommend reading our extended taxonomy paper, which addresses this, is get green right for now, see if these other policies will bed in, which links to the policy links paper. And if not, in the first review period, there's a few tools that you can do to build upon it. Okay, I don't want to say more about transition plans.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I'll give some context, some additional context from my perspective working with the Transition Plan Task Force, where we've been doing a great deal of engagement with other jurisdictions and with international bodies, because as we mentioned earlier, transition plans are kind of a hot topic right now, with a lot of people working on them. And transition finance, writ large, is something that's on the minds of governments around the world and of international governmental sort of bodies as well, sort of multilateral forums. And the reason is that we do need to have an urgent transition that's going to require, very substantial investments and at pace. And every government is wondering how to do this. And every government's talking about transition finance. What is their transition finance policy framework? And in that context, certainly what I see is that every jurisdiction is doing it in a slightly different way, depending on what suits them best and what works best in the national context. So some other geographies have been putting in place transition taxonomies. Very often, they've been combining those with sectoral roadmaps. And in fact, the UK is also now putting forward sectoral roadmaps, has published a few already. And in the Green Finance Strategy, promised to publish more. So that could be a combination that the UK decides to make more of. Equally, a different way of addressing transition finance, which is complementary and also has great uses, is to ensure that firms, and ideally also public sector bodies, have transition plans. So they're looking forward, they're allocating resource to the transition they need to take and thinking about what that's going to look like, also making that plan resilient to the possible risks that might occur and the opportunities that might come up. That's a rather more flexible approach in some ways that can be combined with a taxonomy in the way that we put in our relevant recommendation in the GTAG document. And some geographies, perhaps for cultural or sort of almost political, ideological reasons, are more inclined to take that slightly more flexible approach than to go with a transition taxonomy type. There's also, important roles for other instruments like transition bonds. I think what I'm trying to say overall is that how to finance our transition requires a package of measures. So as Ryan says, it's a mixture of tools. For the UK, transition taxonomy could end up being one. It doesn't necessarily have to be. I think it's a little early to tell, and that's why the sequence that Ryan outlined has been recommended by GTAG.
I'm going to ask one more question and then I'll give you an opportunity to share any final thoughts before we close the webinar. So the last question relates to the concept of a net zero test, which appears in a few of the different recommendations. I wondered if you'd be able to give a little overview of what that consists of and how that can be applied, particularly from the perspective of a local authority. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I'll just go on this one first. So net zero test featured in a few of the policy areas. Specifically, we do also recommend it being developed for local authorities. And there's really two parts to this. The first is having a test on every major spending decision. So over a certain size, looking at the impact by aligning it with the taxonomy. How does it contribute to, which of these activities is it? And that isn't to say that if it isn't aligned, you can't do it, but it's to be able to give that information to the decision makers who can then look at that and trade off against other benefits. So that's the first part of it. And the second part is how you can start to use it to be a budget tagging tool. So there's a lot of talk at the minute around green budgeting, and you could go through your spending plans for the year. And again, you could see how do these align to this science-based dictionary that's been developed over many, many years. How can we see if it aligns to that? And the idea here is, again, on policy coherence. If we're expecting private sector actors to use it to talk about their spending decisions, if the government is starting to use it as it is with its Green Gilt programme, for example, it follows that local authorities who have climate emergency declarations should also be seeking to use the same set of definitions. Coming back to the point from earlier, though, we're very conscious about the lack of resources that exist in local authorities. And a big part of the recommendation in the paper is, again, around providing those resources, providing that training, allowing the upskilling, not making any of this mandatory or binding, just enabling them to have access to the information which can help make more informed decisions that are aligned with the transition.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I honestly don't have a lot to add to that, but I would just reinforce the importance of tracking in terms of why that's useful, apart from it's not just a desire for completism or to have lots of accounts somewhere. If we know what is happening, then we are able to see whether the policies we're taking are working or not. And there's a feedback loop that can work both for the private sector and for the public sector, where if we track what's happening and we see whether we're getting the results we need, we can then change course if something needs to change. So given that we don't have lots of time to get the climate transition right, then it's incredibly important that we're able to have that feedback loop and be able to correct course as we go. And that's why the tracking angle and the role of the taxonomy in that is so important, and in a strong link there to the net zero test, which would help with sort of that allocation of what kind of what kind of category different funds would fall into.
Thanks, Kate. And I've noticed we're now just about at time. So if you've got any final thoughts, first Kate and then Ryan, and then we'll thank everyone else for joining and wish you on your way.
Okay, well, a quick final thought for me is that, it's been fun to do this paper and to expand the universe of things where the taxonomy could be useful in the public sector as well as the private sector. And there's just a huge amount of opportunity that can come from this. You know, when we look at the UK's environmental goals, we look at the intent for the net zero transition, I think the taxonomy's got a really important role to play. And we really hope that the government will look carefully at these use case possibilities as they do produce the taxonomy for consultation later this year, which we all look forward to.
Great, thanks, Kate. Just say thanks to Adam as well for moderating the Q&A there. I guess my final takeaway is similar to Kate. You know, a lot of work, a lot of effort has gone into designing these areas and mapping out how the taxonomy can link to them. And I encourage anyone who's tuned in today to the webinar, who's watched this on the recording, to take the paper away and look at some of those areas, think about how you could seek to develop these further. And please do get in touch with us if you have any questions. You can find my email on LinkedIn and we'll send it in the chat shortly. I think it's going to appear on screen in a second. And you can contact the whole GFI GTAG Secretariat team at gtag@gfi.green. And also the team will send links to the papers round afterwards. All the other advice papers we mentioned can be found on the website as well. But then all that remains to say, sorry we've overrun by 2 minutes. There were so many questions there and apologies I didn't get to all of them. If we didn't answer your question, please do contact myself or Kate and we'll be happy to respond to them. But thanks everyone for joining and hope you have a good rest of the day.